Hello and welcome to SSW TV. My name is Andreas Lengkeek and I'm joined today by William Liebenberg, a solution architect and cloud architect, all about Azure Functions. He's going to tell us here about some of the cool benefits. How are you doing, William?
I'm doing well, Andreas. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Why don't we jump straight into it? Why don't you start us off with what's the general benefits of Azure Functions?
Well, in general, Azure Functions is great. It's one of the sort of best cloud offerings that you can have where you pay only for what you use. In case you only run something for 5 minutes, you pay for that 5 minutes of usage. You don't pay for a server that's always on and never being used. So that sort of consumption-based billing is very important for a lot of businesses. And a lot of people are finding this incredibly valuable. So jumping on this and using Azure Functions quite a lot. And it's also a slightly simplified programming model. It's just your code that gets to run in the cloud. You don't have to worry too much about the hardware underneath. Of course, there's always a server somewhere, but it's mainly focused just on your code. You don't have to really care too much about the capabilities underneath. So I think that's why it's sort of very popular for a lot of people, and you can sort of just focus in on your own application. And along with just the simplified programming model, Azure Functions is also highly based on events. So event-driven applications. So you can pick up things like a HTTP request. That is an event, a HTTP trigger. But there's a whole lot of other stuff. You can have timers running on a schedule. So every time a particular schedule is triggered, it's going to run some of your code. And there's some other really cool stuff as well. You can listen to blob or file changes in a storage account.
That's cool.
If someone it is very cool. So if someone uploads a document, you can be notified of that and go and do some off-the-side processing. Maybe generate some thumbnails or calculate the reading time, that kind of stuff.
So are there other services that it can do that with, like Service Bus as well?
Oh yeah, Service Bus is one of my favorites. So you can again use Service Bus, and a message that is sent through the bus can then trigger some of your Azure Function code. Not just Service Bus, you've got all the other messaging offerings like Event Hub, Event Grid, and IoT Hub. For instance, little IoT devices can sense, for instance, a temperature change or a moisture change in your sort of e-garden that you're building, and that can trigger your code to run, and you can analyze that and go, hey, this may be a temperature or a humidity spike, and you can then send another event to fire off an actuator that is controlled by a Raspberry Pi, for instance, and open up a vent to take care of the temperature and humidity in that room. So you can actually do some really, really cool stuff with...
Really powerful stuff, yeah, wow.
It's super powerful, yes. And you get addicted to it pretty quickly. So, what we also have with Azure Functions is the scalability is a big thing. Because it's small applications, simple code that we write, it's also easy for this to scale out. So in comparison to a normal web app, we have to scale out the whole server, replicate the whole application, and a lot of the startup times it's just quite high. Azure Functions has some of that, so there is always going to be a little bit of cold start, but you can scale it really quickly. In a normal consumption-based Azure Functions plan, you can scale up to 200 instances, 200 CPUs running the same code. It's pretty, that's very hard to do with a normal app service, for instance, but Azure Functions makes that quite easy. And the good thing is, like I said earlier, you pay for just what you use. So if your app is only used, say, once a week, or only for like an hour a day, you pay for just that load that you're consuming, and the rest of the day, the application scales down to 0. So there's no code running, there's no CPUs ready to go, and you don't pay for anything. So it's very cost effective.
And do you rely on Azure for sort of automated scaling and stuff to take care of that for you, and you can set up rules and the like?
Well, it's basically just out of the box. You can control some of the scaling factors. There's the host.json file where you can say, how many messages to process off a queue, or how many partitions and batches you want to break things into. So there's some control there, but the out-of-the-box offering is hits a sweet spot in most situations. Yeah.
Fantastic. And it really is just your one function, a piece of code that you can optimize to as much as you want, and then you can just scale the one method. You don't have to deal with the rest of the infrastructure, the rest of the hardware that normally would come with a regular app.
Yes, that's quite right. So if you write the small Azure Function apps compared to a monolithic web app, for instance. Scaling out the whole web app for just a tiny feature, it's quite a waste in my opinion. It has been done, obviously, but we have new ways of doing things. So if you want to have a process that is, for instance, an expensive process in your web app, if you slice that out and run that off to the side as an Azure function, you can scale just that function. It relieves all that pressure from your main web application, and it definitely, it almost always pays off. Everyone quite likes that solution.
Yeah, and it sounds like you can scale like different functions independently based on demand.
Yes, that's right. So you can look at, say, processing incoming HTTP requests, and they can put a message on the service bus or in a queue, and that could be a separate application that picks it up, and they can scale in their own way. You can definitely utilize the cloud in such a way, and you only pay for what you really need, and it's sort of no waste. We're quite efficient in our usage.
Yeah. Well, Azure Functions is so powerful. Can you tell us a little bit about what is some of the new features coming out that you're really excited for?
Oh, so .NET 5 and Azure Functions, now there's a preview 1 released recently, which means our .NET applications are no longer tied to the runtime. They're no longer in the same process. Now they're separate processes, which means the dependencies that our application may have on things like, say, Newtonsoft, JSON versus the runtime might use system.txt, for instance. Sometimes there's some conflicts there, or even just a version conflict between the same library, where I would like to use the latest version of the blob client, for instance, but the runtime might have one that's maybe 1 or 2 versions behind. Yeah, it happens, but no longer will that happen anymore. We can have a complete separation from our app and the runtime, the 2 separate processes, and all the sort of non.NET languages like JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, F#, Java, PowerShell as well. They've had the benefit of this out-of-process model for since Azure Functions v2, and now finally we have that with .NET as well. And quite excited about that. There's also some newer stuff coming in with .NET 5 where we can customize the middleware pipeline. That's something that's never really existed in Azure Functions, but now it's going to come out of the box. In fact, we've got a product, a SaaS offering called Sophie Bot. It's like a digital assistant, which can help you in the office to know what people's skills are, to find the right person for the right job, what's their availability, are they currently in the office, or are they working on client site, or are they at home, for instance? So we got a whole bunch of stuff in there, but we wrote this, I think, late 2018. We started on that with Azure Functions as part of the back end, and we didn't have any of this cool stuff. So we had to invent our own middleware pipeline. We had to write up our own dependency injection framework. There's some There's some frameworks out there that people try to make available, but then either they end up being non-maintained or it didn't quite deliver on what we wanted. We couldn't quite guarantee that the lifetime of the services we were trying to inject was being adhered to. So we took it on to write our own one, and in fact, it's still running today. We haven't needed to really replace it yet because it's working. But now with Azure Functions 3 and .NET 5, the next version coming out, all of that stuff that we had to invent back then was quite hard. Now we get it out of the box. It's quite nice. So looking at the examples for .NET 5 Preview 1 and what we wrote back then is sort of very similar. So I'm glad we went down the right path. Or at least maybe fantastic. Microsoft is following us.
It's looking at the code, pulling it in.
Yeah, so I think, the hardest part was making sure that we had a nice DI framework, that we could then also keep our code clean. It's all about clean architecture, clean code, and keeping it maintainable and portable. So, when we now have to upgrade to the later version, it's going to be fairly straightforward, I think.
So this is back in the olden time, it was version 1, version 2 of Azure Functions, where you didn't have its own built-in DI framework?
Yes, so Azure Functions V1 didn't have any of that. It was, the first version is quite, I guess, basic. V2 had a few improvements, but it still didn't have a DI framework until probably about halfway through its lifetime. May 2019, they introduced the dependency injection out of the box for Azure Functions V2. And so we've been that's been available for quite some time. But we started with our Sophie bot before any of that was available. I wish I can't wait for the time to come to just go and refactor everything and upgrade it to the latest and greatest. So hopefully that's soon.
Yeah, hopefully next time you're on the bench, we can get on that.
That's super
That's right.
exciting.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. So thank you so much for your time, William. Kind of today we learned about the general benefits of Azure Functions, simple programming model. You're just writing a method that runs in the cloud. It's easy to scale. It'll scale based on demand. You don't have to worry about scaling up your whole infrastructure and everything like that. And you can just pay for what you use. If you're using it at a very high busy period from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. And not at all during middle of the night, then it can handle that and not charge you for work when there is no work, which is fantastic. And then there's also some new and exciting features coming out. Triggers with files and blob storage and documents on Cosmos DB and Service Bus, all that exciting stuff. And then fantastic offerings where .NET 5 now out of process and the customizable middleware pipelines. It's super exciting time to be a cloud architect.
Oh, it is. Yes, get to build a lot of cool applications. So very happy.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to collaborating with you more, William. Thanks for your time today. Cheers, guys. Thanks for tuning in to SSW TV, and see you next time.